This is 5 on 20 News, where the news is fresh, but the newscasters are fresher, with Zaira, Livier
and Jeff Weber. It's Tuesday, April 2nd, and we're live in our studios in downtown Tucson. First, the local headlines.
The defense attorney for former Joe Arpaio has jumped ship just 3 weeks before he's set to stand trial. Lead defense attorney Mel McDonald asked to withdraw from the case in a brief stating that he's leaving in, quote, good cause, but didn't elaborate further. Arpaio faces charges of disobeying a judge's orders when he was told to stop his racist immigration posse. He's already been found in civil contempt for violating the rule, but the trial will decide if he did so willingly. McDonald's request comes days after a request to delay the trial was denied. The defense tried to bar statements Arpaio made on the campaign that would be construed as racist because he's Joe Arpaio and that's what he does. Another request for delay claimed Arpaio was coerced into admitting to civil contempt in the case. The request said that Arpaio was told by his attorneys to admit guilt and that he thought this would help him avoid criminal charges. So to unpack that a bit, his lawyers said that Arpaio couldn't stand trial because his lawyers misled him. Oddly enough, that notion was filed by Arpaio's other attorney, Mark Goldman, who is now the lead. It hasn't been admitted publicly, but this is likely the reason why McDonald wanted out. Either that, or he was just sick of Arpaio's request to wear pink underwear.
An appeals court ruled against the state of Arizona in a challenge to the EPA over emissions control measures. The EPA measure was meant to improve visibility at federal parks, but the state said that they already had their own emissions control plan. But the EPA disapproved of portions of the plan, particularly the parts that allowed higher levels of copper smelting and emissions from cement kilns. Previous decisions ruled that the EPA acted within its authority, which the Ninth Appeals Court agreed with this time around. The appeals court said that the state's argument was invalid because the concerns weren't raised during the comment period. This will be the third time that the rule was challenged by Arizona since 2011.
Maricopa County is considering going to only mail-in ballots for the 2018 election. County Recorder Adrian Fontes said that the move could save Maricopa over $30 million over the next few years because they would no longer need staff and polling place equipment. Already, about 80% of Maricopa residents use mail-in ballots since its introduction 10 years ago. According to Fontes, those who lose or forget to send their ballots would be able to come to a polling place to drop off the ballot. In order to make the change, Fontes would need the County Board of Supervisors and the voters to approve the change of law. Other changes planned by Fontes include reviewing about 40,000 voter registrations that were discarded in the last election. These registration forms were found last week in a box because they didn't include the mandatory proof citizenship that are supposed to accompany them. Fontes also has a goal of delivering final ballot counts to no more than 72 hours after an election. He hopes to achieve this by hiring more temporary staff to count the ballots. However, a bill by State Rep. Michelle Ugent-Rita would strip Fontes of his ability to run election. Rita's bill focuses on an arcane Arizona law that requires counties to reapprove or deny the county recorder's power to run elections. Rita says that House Bill 2179 is a sign of good government, while Fontes calls it political sour grapes since he's the first Democrat county recorder in 50 years. There's nothing more exciting than beef between a county recorder and a state rep. Drake and Meek Mill will better step aside.
Yesterday, the city of Tucson cleared out a crowded homeless camp located near the Davis-Monthan Air Force Base. Service providers, environmental teams, and police officers showed up to help close the camp. About 20 to 40 people have been using the space for years, but were ordered to leave after a request made by the base. The land is leased to the city by the Air Force. In February, social workers began posting signs warning that the camp would close and offered help finding jobs and shelter. Many of the camp's residents have been set up with local service providers to begin the process of finding more permanent housing. However, many haven't yet found services and find themselves in limbo, which has led some to think that the eviction date of April 3rd would be extended. But police say that it's considered trespassing if anyone is in the camp past that date. City officials say that the camp will be replaced by a bike path, which will be paved with the tiers of homeless so retirees can enjoy their fancy-free afternoons.
Tribal leaders are trying to gain support for a bill that will grant an exemption from national labor laws. The Tribal Labor Sovereignty Act of 2017 was introduced by Arizona Rep. Paul Gosar and will establish a separation of tribal governments and the federal government when it comes into labor laws. Navajo National Council Delegate Nathaniel Brown, along with other leaders, told an education subcommittee that the bill would allow each tribe like its own entity. Under the bill, tribes would no longer be subject to oversight by the National Labor Relations Board, the federal agency in charge of labor enforcement. However, critics say that the bill would remove many protections that tribal workers currently have. They say that the bill would also allow companies operating in tribal areas the ability to freeze out unions. John Gribben of the group Unite Here said that the bill would open the door to, quote, harassment and other forms of discrimination. Gribben said that the tribal workers deserve better protections than they do in the U.S. The bill was introduced in response to a court case from 2004 involving the NLRB, where they accused a national casino of unfair labor practices. Before this case, the tribal lands were historically exempt from government labor reviews, while Gribben said that the NLRB would not interfere with tribal government affairs. The president of the National Congress of American Indians said that regulations always end up influencing governmental affairs. Congress President Brian Kladusby said that the NLRB and other government agencies take away the tribal government's right to govern itself. He also said that unions and tribes will work together to improve working conditions. Based upon our nation's history of working together with tribes, this should work out great for the natives.
A new full-service primary health clinic opened yesterday in downtown Tucson. Mayor Jonathan Rothschild said that the clinic is, quote, a critical piece of the long-term plan for downtown. He said that having a full-service clinic downtown encourages more people to move to the area. The center, called Health on Tucson, was created through a partnership with TMC and El Rio Community Health Center. The center is filled with state-of-the-art equipment, including check-in kiosks, exam rooms, and dialogue rooms for those not needing the exam rooms. It offers primary care, wellness coaching, counseling, x-rays, and much more. Patients can also be seen by virtual health visits, where they talk to a doctor on their smartphones. The preventative care program offers a wide variety of activities, including yoga, tai chi, and African dance drumming. TMC President Judy Rich said the hospital's future depends on these types of partnerships, and that clinics like Health On are one way to reduce healthcare costs by focusing on primary and preventative care within the community. TMC and El Rio say that this is only the start of many similar clinics that will come out of the partnership. So if you're asking questions like, does this look infected? The center is open Monday through Friday, 7 a.m. to 9 p.m., and Saturdays from 8 to 5. There's also a 24/7 phone nurse triage. The center is located at 1 West Broadway Boulevard. Sorry.
And I wanted to take a moment to talk about the program that you're watching right now. Here at 5 on 20, we are undertaking a new kind of citizen journalism. We are going to give you the news as we see it, and we want more people to speak up with us. We need writers, hosts, anchors, camera people, sound people, the whole gamut. The times require a new way of informing ourselves, so join us, do it now. Email us at info@creativetucson.org to get involved. And if you think there's a story we're missing, a person we should interview, an upcoming event we should cover, or have any other news tips for us, shoot us an email to info@creativetucson.org. We are here for you, and we want to cover all stories from all points of views, so don't be strangers. Now in national and international news.
So, dozens of people were killed in Syria after government forces launched a gas attack in northern Idlib province this morning. This would be the worst case of the Assad regime using chemical weapons against its people. After the first airstrike, another attack rained down on a clinic used for treating victims of past airstrikes. The White Helmets, a group of Syrians who monitor airstrikes and rescue victims, said that at least 50 were dead and 250 were wounded, including many women and children. 5 of the rescue workers suffered from being exposed to the chemical substances in the bombs, while chlorine attacks have become common by Assad. Witnesses said that this was a different substance because it killed more people. Symptoms such as reduced pupils showed evidence of nerve agents and other toxins that are banned under international law. Others became sick by coming into contact with victims, another sign that this wasn't the usual chlorine attack. On Friday, the Trump administration said that it wouldn't be pursuing regime change in Syria because of, quote, political realities. Critics say that the announcement emboldened the Assad regime to use the chemical weapons against its people. The U.S. condemned the attack, calling it, quote, reprehensible act that, quote, cannot be ignored by the civilian world. However, the civilized world. However, White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer declined to answer a question on whether the administration would change its policy on regime change. So I guess we're going to ignore it, proving that we're not a member of the civilized world. Spicer said that the president can't, quote, telegraph what we are going to do because that would involve the president having to make a difficult decision, which he doesn't seem to do very well unless it involves Twitter. But the White House was quick to decide on blaming the Obama administration for the bombing. Spicer called the attack a result of Obama's, quote, weakness and irresolution, right before avoiding a difficult question from the press and saying that the administration can't make any decisions yet.
According to some immigration advocates, the resistance against Trump's policies are actually helping the president's agenda. Elizabeth Mateo, an LA-based activist, says that Trump's strategy is to create fear among immigrants so that they leave on their own. This is being played out by the increasing number of immigrants seeking attorneys and information about ICE raids. This is despite the fact that there hasn't actually been an increase in deportations under Trump. Mexico's foreign minister said last month that there was no rise in deported Mexicans, and that number has actually fallen slightly. Mexico's council in Los Angeles said that about 50 people in the area have been deported since Trump's inauguration, a much lower number than under President Obama. However, fear is clearly growing to the point where immigrants across the country are afraid of reporting crimes for fear of being deported. Mateo said that the media reports of mass deportations are helping further Trump's agenda by contributing to this fear. However, Chris Newman of the National Day Labor Organizing Network said that the only option is to keep resisting, even if it means amplifying Trump's message. But Mateo says that the warnings from activists and the media are, quote, disempowering. because it paints an inaccurate picture while telling immigrants that their situation is more hopeless than it really is. Janine Jackson, Program Director of Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, or FAIR, said that journalists need to report fear without fueling the fire. Rather than cover every deportation, she said that journalists should focus on how the Trump administration is trying to sow this fear into the immigrant population to help them be more aware of this strategy. In related news, Trump warned in a press conference that there's been sightings of La Planchada, or the Iron Lady, a famous ghost in Mexican culture. Later, it was revealed that La Planchada is actually just Jeff Sessions wearing white bed sheets.
A new study found that children who live in regions that switched from nuclear power to coal-fired power stations are born smaller. Researchers looked at the impact of the Mile Island accident in Pennsylvania in 1979, where a nuclear power station suffered from a partial meltdown. Following the incident, nuclear power was scrapped in the Tennessee Valley area and replaced with coal. Edison Severmini, one of the authors, said that the policymakers thought they were protecting public health with the decision, but exposed people to the indirect risks of coal-fired power. The study found that children in the Tennessee Valley area had a 5.4% decrease in birth weight in the 18 months following the nuclear shutdown. The impact was greatest in areas that had the greatest increase in coal power plants. The author credits the effect to air pollution caused from the coal-fired power plants. Severmini concluded that babies are more likely to be affected if they are exposed to air pollution in the final 3 months. Those born 3 months before the switch of coal did not experience the decrease in weight. Jonathan Griggs, a professor at Queen Mary University in London, also studies the effect of air pollution on newborn babies. He said that the study's conclusions fit with his research, showing that air pollution leads to lower birth weight. Griggs said that the study's findings could have important implications for the U.S., as Trump has called for an expansion on the coal industry. So Trump's future for the Tennessee Valley will be filled with tiny green people who work in the coal mines.
A report by ProPublica revealed that a change to Donald Trump's trust agreement allows him to withdraw money without revealing it to the public. When asked about the report, White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer denied the allegations and dismissed ProPublica as a, quote, left-leaning blog. In reality, it is a nonprofit who engages in deep investigative journalism lasting for months. Spicer did, however, admit that Trump can make the withdrawals from his account, but claimed that there was no change in policy to allow this, and that there's nothing illegal about the practice. According to ProPublica, the unreported changes in agreement occurred on February 10th. The agreement stipulates that it, quote, shall distribute net income or principal to Donald J. Trump at his request. This income can include profits from any of his 400 businesses, which the president claims to not be running. Trump agreed to give up his business empire to his sons after he was elected, but so far, Trump hasn't been transparent about his attempts to distance himself from his businesses. Other reports from Florida show that Trump has not submitted the paperwork necessary to turn over the control of his businesses in the state. Also, as a part of the change, Trump is not required to disclose when he makes a withdrawal from his account. The only way to find out what he withdraws is through his tax returns, which Trump has refused to disclose, besides that little one-year teaser from 2 weeks ago that turned out to be inadequate. And last week, the General Services Administration released documents addressing conflicts of interest involving the Trump International Hotel in D.C. It says that the hotel's profits go into a separate account that can only be used for hotel maintenance, improvements, or debt payments. But critics say that the profits go back into the hotel, which make the property more valuable and, in turn, benefit Trump financially. The Trump administration conveniently announced yesterday that Trump deposited his first quarter salary to the National Park Service. So our country is basically his ATM at this point. Let's hope he forgets his PIN.
Sketchy Russian connections are back in the news, like a mosquito who won't go away. It began with a Washington Post report stating that Eric Prince, the founder of Blackwater, met with Russian close to Vladimir Putin to set up a back channel to Russia. Blackwater is a private military contractor who operates all over the world. Prince is a Trump supporter who donated to his campaign and is the brother of Education Secretary Betsy DeVos. The agenda of the Russian meeting is still unclear, but the Post reported that the United Arab Emirates set up the meeting to see if they could roll back Russia's support for Iran. Russia has been supporting the Assad regime in the Syrian civil war with airstrikes and intelligence. Iran is closely aligned with Assad and opposed to the Sunni resistance. Asked about the meetings, Sean Spicer denied that Prince had a role in the Trump transition team. A spokesman for Prince said that the meeting is irrelevant and the, quote, Big Brother surveillance should be a larger concern among the American public. He said that the meeting had nothing to do with Trump and said that the intelligence community should be busy fighting terrorists instead of spying on American citizens. This isn't the only connection between the White House and the UAE. White House aide Steve Bannon met with Prince Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan of the UAE in December when the prince visited New York. Officials only learned of the meeting when they saw Zayed's name on a flight list. This is a breach of rules because the UAE is supposed to tell the White House in advance of a visit by a head of state. Zayed was also said to have met Vladimir Putin twice last year to talk about Russia's policy towards Iran. Putin says they mostly talked about the last Fast and Furious movie and how much he wants to try that indoor ski slope in Dubai. On to Russia's sketchiness part 2. A former advisor to Donald Trump's campaign met with Russia intelligence operative before the election, according to a BuzzFeed report. Carter Page, the advisor, met with Viktor Podolhany, a Russian intelligence agent who was later charged as an unregistered agent for a foreign government. Page confirmed that he was the figure dubbed Male 1 in the infamous dossier compiled by a British spy. The dossier claims that the Russians colluded with Trump's campaign and blackmailed the president by collecting video footage of Trump having some wet fun with prostitutes. At the time of the meeting, Page said that the Russian agent was working at Moscow's United Nations office. But he was really an agent with the SVR, Russia's Foreign Intelligence Unit. Profini, also, along with 2 other agents, was later investigated by the U.S. for running a Russian spy ring in the country. Page denies that he acted improperly with the Russian agent and says that he did not help them in any way. In the dossier, various conversations of Russian agents describing Page as a fool who wanted to, quote, rise up by being involved with Gazprom, Russia's national oil giant. FBI Director James Comey is in the process of investigating Russian involvement with the 2016 election. If the dossier turns out to be true, then that means Comey is being paid to watch hours of peeing videos and will probably need treatment for PTSD.
Ecuador's election is being contested after early results showed that left-wing socialist Lenin Moreno beat his right-wing challenger banker Guillermo Lasso. Lasso demanded a recount when the vote tallied at 51 to 48% so far. Lasso also claimed that there was voter fraud and called on his supporters to take to the streets and protest the results. Moreno was the vice president of outgoing President Rafael Correa, a socialist who poured money into Ecuador's lower class to improve education, infrastructure, and healthcare in the impoverished country. If Moreno wins the election, it will stem the recent wave of right-wing wins across the world, including Donald Trump in the U.S., Theresa May in the UK, and potentially Marine Le Pen in France. It also comes at a time when left-wing leaders in South America are facing troubles. Venezuela's economy is crumbling under socialist leader Nicolás Maduro, while left-wing leaders in Argentina, Brazil, and Peru have all been taken down by scandals. While protesters took to the streets chanting "No to fraud," Moreno took to the stage to give his victory speech beside Correa. Lasso is a former banker who promised tax cuts for businesses and more foreign investment. He also promised to eject WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange after 30 days. Assange has been staying in the Ecuadorian embassy in the UK for the past 4 years. Assange says he's grown comfortable in his new home and spends his days talking to a melon, a head of cabbage, and a grapefruit, who he pretends are Hillary Clinton, Putin, and Donald Trump.
Yesterday, Donald Trump met with a fellow hater of free speech in Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi. Trump gushed over the infamous violator of human rights, saying that the U.S. is, quote, very much behind el-Sisi. The Egyptian president took over the country in a coup, then arrested the former president Mohamed Morsi since he took power. El-Sisi has been described as a tyrant who imprisons individuals who criticize his rule. However, he's looked at as friendlier to the U.S. than Morsi because he has cracked down on terrorist groups. In contrast, Morsi came from the political wing of the Muslim Brotherhood, a group who some U.S. politicians, like Ted Cruz, considered a terrorist group. This would be el-Sisi's first visit to the White House, as President Obama refused to invite him to Washington when he was in office. Trump said that, quote, "We agree on so many things, such as hatred for the press and the virtues of nepotism." Trump also said that el-Sisi has done a, quote, "fantastic job in a very difficult position." In turn, el-Sisi said that he had a deep appreciation for Trump's, quote, "unique personality." Well, he certainly is unique. Trump must have forgotten to mention the numerous human rights abuses and general fear that el-Sisi has created in Egypt. Remember that the Arab Spring uprising occurred in 2011 to protest against the tyrannical leadership of Hosni Mubarak. Mubarak was an ally of the United States because he pretended to crack down on terrorism while simultaneously cracking down on everything else, like free speech and the press. Support for Mubarak caused a lot of anti-US sentiment and had been said to contribute to the uptick in terroristic group support among Egyptians. Critics charge that history is repeating itself, but Trump says this is different because Mubarak had a thicker head of hair.
Bernie Sanders is once again trying to send you to college for free, and this time he's actually got some support from lawmakers. Yesterday, Sanders reintroduced the College for All Act with co-sponsorships from Senators Elizabeth Warren, Richard Blumenthal, Chris Murphy, Kamala Harris, and Kirsten Gillibrand. The new version backs off from some of the former bill's promises in order to make it easier to pass. It actually hews a bit closer to Hillary Clinton's plan on the campaign trail. If passed, the law would give U.S. citizens free college tuition for four-year public colleges in households earning less than $125,000 per year. Community colleges would be free for everyone, while interest rates on student loans would be cut in half. Tuition would be paid for partly by dealing out a large sales tax on financial transactions. It would also forbid the federal government from profiting off of student loan programs. While student debt continues to be a huge problem for young people in the U.S., Agent Orange has barely mentioned the issue. On the campaign trail, Trump introduced a plan that would require borrowers to pay 12.5% of their income towards student loans for 15 years. After that point, the rest of the loan would be forgiven. Critics have said that the plan would actually increase the debt burden on some lower income borrowers who would normally pay a lower percentage towards their debt. At the same time, a Medicare for All bill reintroduced by John Conyers has now 80 co-sponsors, the most support on record. The bill would essentially set up a national healthcare system open to every U.S. citizen. It looks like the worse Trump gets, the more the country moves to the left. Maybe we should be encouraging the president to continue being terrible. For all of his faults, Trump was able to do something we thought was impossible. He caused the Democrats to grow some balls. This was Zaira Livier.
And Jeff Weber. Next up, Andrew explains it all. Check it out.
Hello again, everybody, and welcome to Andrew Explains It All. I'm Andrew Conlog, and that's my job, to explain it all about a particular subject in Tucson or Southern Arizona history. And if you've watched some of the other iterations of this segment, you know I usually talk about the Old West, because that's sort of what's most popular in terms of this area. But today, I'm going to skip forward in time a little bit to World War II. And I'm not going to talk about something that happened in Tucson, but I'm going to talk about a battle, a little known but very interesting battle in World War II that some Tucsonans participated in very heavily, I guess you could say. And that's the Battle of Attu in the Aleutian Islands campaign of the Pacific War. Now, not a lot of people have heard about the Battle of Attu, even among World War II buffs. It's not real well known. So I'll go into a little bit of the context of the Battle of Attu, and then I'll talk about what the Tucsonans did. So Attu, if you haven't even heard of where that is, it's a little island in the Aleutian Islands, and if you haven't heard of where that is, the Aleutian Islands are a long chain of islands coming down from Alaska. They're thousands of miles, and actually Attu, which is a tiny little island, near another island in the chain called Kiska, which is a little larger. Kiska comes into it a little while later, so I'm going to mention that now. They are both about as close to Alaska as they are to Japan. So you picture how far away and long this island chain is. And that's partly why Attu becomes part of World War II, because early on in the war, which is when the Japanese were really winning the war. Ever since Pearl Harbor at that point, the Japanese were really, they were running a lot of victories. And they decided that they were going to conquer this little island of Attu and the nearby larger island of Kiska. There are about 12 people on Attu. The Japanese either killed or put them all in POW camps for the rest of the war. And there they were. Now, I've heard a couple of different versions as to exactly why the Japanese conquered these islands. One is that at around the same time they were getting ready for their plan for Midway, which you'll probably recognize the Battle of Midway, probably, if not the most, then one of the most important battles in the whole Pacific War. And the point where that string of Japanese victories gets turned right around, and then it's the Americans that are winning, kind of the turning point. But at the time, the Japanese were kind of trying to make their own knockout blow in the Pacific in Midway. And the idea was that, well, we'll conquer these islands that are American, and so America will have to respond. They'll be distracted up there while we're doing our stuff down here in Midway. Now, I've also heard that the Japanese genuinely wanted to take over the islands and then use that as a staging point to take over Alaska, and then maybe use Alaska to take over the continental United States, or try to. But no matter what the Japanese plan was, this was American territory that the Axis had conquered, and they had to be stopped from the American perspective. And that's where our Tucsonans come in. A force was sent that consisted of some Tucsonans. Most famously, there were a couple of guys that ended up participating pretty greatly, I guess you could say. A guy named Morton Sollitt and a guy named Joe Underwood. I hope I'm pronouncing both of those correctly. They're U of A graduates. They were part of the Arizona National Guard. They had been called up by President Roosevelt before the war even started. And they talk about when they were first reporting to their commander. He's a guy named Colonel Frank Cullen. And everybody was kind of scared of him. They were being warned about this guy. He's a salty old soldier, and when they came in, it was true. He was cussing everybody out and stuff. And then when they were gonna go meet him, he kind of looks around and calls up the U of A people. I want to see the 2 U of A people. And they're looking at each other like, what? This mean guy wants to see us? And so they come up. And then immediately his whole demeanor changes and he smiles and he's shaking their hand because Colonel Frank Cullen was a U of A grad and a Tucson guy. And out of the Tucsonans, he probably plays the most prominent role since he was a senior commander in this battle, but you'll see, I'll get into that. Anyway, they all become buddies basically, even with the differences in rank. Colonel Cullen brings them back to Tucson on leave. He gets leave as an officer and he's like, hey, come with me, come back to Tucson. And then they all go to California for training and they're playing ping pong together and stuff, and they're buddies, which will serve them well in the coming battle. And they started planning and training for this battle. They didn't know exactly where they were going to go yet, even though the military brass did. So they're doing practice landings on beaches when Joe Underwood actually injures his arm and it's in a sling. And he gets the option, he's like, your arm's in a sling, so you don't have to go if you don't want to. But he's like, no, I'm definitely going. And he's got that brave fighting spirit. So he's got his arm in a sling the whole time, but he goes. And so they ship out and they find out they're going to the Aleutian Islands. And they land on an island called Adak. And Adak is fairly close to Attu and Kiska by Aleutian Island standards. And by that I mean it's hundreds of miles away, but that's the best you can do up there. So there was a pretty great engineering feat, and the Army engineers created in about 10 days an airstrip. And one of the Tucsonans, another one of the Tucsonans was part of that engineer group, so thank you to that Tucsonan as well. And they started launching bombings and attack runs on Attu to try to get it ready for the invasion. And while they're doing that, Frank Cullen is sitting around with the other senior commanders, and they realize that in the whole time that the Aleutians have been part of American territory, there have been maps of the coastlines of these islands, at some of them anyway. Unfortunately, there was one for Attu that was maybe like 90 years old, but there's been no maps of the interior. Nobody's ever done that. So what's interesting is that the Japanese, since they've been there a while, actually know more about the territory than the Americans do, even though it is American territory. So they basically are like, well, we got to figure this out. So they look at this map and they find this place that they think would be good for a landing zone. They call it Red Beach, kind of like in the codes, like if you heard of D-Day, all the different beaches. This was Red Beach. And they say basically, we got to look at this place because we know what the coast looks like from a 90-year-old map, but we don't really know if it's going to work for a landing. So they volunteer Colonel Frank Cullen to lead a force that will recon the area beforehand. So he's going to be the first guy that's going to go on the island at all. And that's probably a suicide mission. I mean, especially if the Japanese are aware and if they're defending that beach, if this small little force goes ashore, there's a good chance that he'll get killed. But he is under no illusions as to the reality of that, but he goes anyway. And he's very lucky because the Japanese commander had heard a few weeks before, had received some intelligence that there was going to be American invasion of Attu. And he had people on the beaches and he had sentries and everything and had it well guarded. But that he had the timing wrong and he thought it was going to come earlier. So he kept doing this for a couple of weeks and then nothing happened. So he was like, well, I was probably wrong. And he brings everybody in a couple hours before Frank Cullen and his guys go ashore. So bad timing on the Japanese part, but very lucky for Frank. He's met unopposed. He looks around. He's able to get back fine. And he basically says, you know, it's not going to be great no matter what because Attu is really weird, and it was. A lot of those Aleutian Islands are very strange. There's a lot of hills. It was originally like volcanic rock and stuff, and the weather's terrible, as you can probably imagine. There's fog, there's snow, it's bitterly cold. There are these windstorms, these horrible windstorms that just kind of pop up out of nowhere that are called willowaws, and so he's just saying, you know, we're not going to do great no matter what we're doing, but Red Beach is fine, so let's go. And that's what they do. And so they all land, Frank and Morton and Joe and the rest of them, and they start the Battle of Attu. Now, the next big thing, nearby Red Beach, there's another series of bays that are called collectively Holt's Bay. And the commanders there on Attu realized that Taking Holt's Bay won't necessarily mean they're going to win right away, and that won't be the end of the Battle of Attu, but it was the most important Japanese position on the island. That was there the airstrip was, there were people on ridges, and everybody was pretty well dug in. So if they can take Holt's Bay, that probably means the Americans are eventually going to win. So that becomes important. And Frank Cullen is in charge of taking Holt's Bay, and Morton Sollitt and Joe Underwood are part of that effort as well. And they eventually do it, but not without a couple of close calls. Unfortunately, one of them was that Colonel Cullen ordered some airstrikes on the Japanese position, and there was some confusion, probably with all the weather and everything, and just how difficult it was to communicate. And the airstrikes struck the American positions, and Morton Sollitt and Joe Underwood write about this later. They survived, but they said that was obviously pretty scary, because they're trying to signal that they're Americans and that the planes are Americans, but it doesn't work, and unfortunately there are some friendly fire casualties. But eventually they do take over Holt's Bay, and when they do that, when that circulates back to the War Department, that's when the Secretary of War decides it's safe to lift the information blackout. Up till this point, the general public didn't know that there was an effort to retake the Aleutian Islands, and they didn't want any kind of that information getting out for intelligence reasons, but they figure that with this conquest of Holt's Bay, it's good enough, and that we're on our way to victory, so we can let people know. And so a lot of very nice stories come out about the Battle of Attu, and especially about the Tucsonans. There's a nice picture of Colonel Cullen with his helmet, and he's got like the grass on it for camouflage, and he's there, and just a lot of complimentary things, especially about the Tucsonans in local and national papers. Anyway, that wasn't the end of it, though. The Battle of Attu dragged on. There were more casualties to the terrain and to the weather. A guy under Morton Sollitt's command actually fell off a mountain in the fog, so that was one unfortunate casualty. But they kept going. Actually, well, everybody kept going except for Joe Underwood. He finally just lost the use of his arm. I mean, he really went for it, but it finally was just too much, and so they sent him back, and he recovered in a hospital in California, and the battle was over by the time he was recovered. Morton Sollitt kept going. He ran into Frank Cullen at one point, and Frank Cullen kind of grimly was like, well, Sollitt, how'd you like to be back in Arizona now? And I'm sure they both would, because I think we'd all agree, Arizona is better than the Battle of Attu era Attu, when there are Japanese in the weather trying to kill you. But they pressed on. Morton Sollitt actually got a battlefield promotion to be a lieutenant, and his soldiers were so happy that they found a downed Japanese aircraft and kind of rigged up some lieutenant's bars for him to put on his shirt until he got his actual lieutenant's bars. So that was kind of nice, a little levity in this horrific situation. And it got more horrific because finally the Japanese were surrounded. They had been taken off all of the island, and they were surrounded with their backs to the sea. There were about 1,000 of them at this point out of what originally had been 2,500 of them, almost all of those having been killed. A lot of the Americans write about how the Japanese would not surrender, and they had to kill all of them as they were going forward. And that was sort of the idea that they were operating under, and that's what the Japanese commander decided to do going forward, because I think the ostensible idea was that maybe they would find a way to actually win this Battle of Attu, but ultimately I think they knew that it wasn't going to happen, so they did one last, which would basically amount to a suicide attack. And in the night, while the Americans were sleeping, they just went through the American lines as fast as they could, killing people as they went, tried to get behind them, and then that was the goal. They'd be behind them at that point, maybe could capture some of their artillery and stuff. And that was obviously pretty scary. Some of the Tucsonans write about how they're sleeping in their sleeping bags, or trying to with this cold, terrible weather, and then the Japanese, which are supposed to be several miles away, just show up and start killing people. But the Americans are able to get that under control. That final assault is repulsed, and when the Japanese finally realize that this really isn't going to happen, about 500 of them commit suicide. And out of the original 2,500, only 28 are taken captive after they surrendered. The rest have died either from weather, from Americans, or having killed themselves. And that brutal ending was the end of the Battle of Attu. Now, a couple of little epilogues. First, geopolitically, I had mentioned Kiska before. Kiska was bigger, it was closer to Alaska, but there were more Japanese there, so the Americans decided we're going to take Attu first, and then we're going to come back for Kiska. And everybody was worrying about this because this relatively small battle turned out to be really, really brutal, and now this probably much bigger battle is going to be even worse. But interestingly, the Japanese High Command decided that it was over, basically. After they lost Attu, they thought, well, we really can't hold Kiska anymore. So under cover of darkness and weather and everything, the Japanese all evacuate from Kiska. And the Americans don't notice this. They're able to sneak away, basically. And they start, after the Battle of Attu, doing these things like when Colonel Cullen reconnoitered Red Beach and they're looking around on Kiska, realize there's nobody there. And that's the end of the Aleutian Islands campaign. And no part of American territory, at least up in North America, is savaged by the Axis anymore in World War II. And as a final little coda for our Tucsonans, right afterward, the conquering hero, Frank Cullen, writes a letter to his beloved University of Arizona, specifically to A.L. Sloniker, at that time the director of alumni relations, who, if you're familiar with the university, the Sloniker House, where the Honors College is, that's named after him. And he writes a letter indicating the exemplary service of the U of A boys, the Wildcats, on the Battle of Attu. And with that in mind, this has been Andrew Explains It All. I'm Andrew Conlog, and I will see you on our next iteration.